I knew the HOA had a reputation for being unreasonable, but when they sent me a notice demanding I remove my fence, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The letter, taped aggressively to my front gate as if it carried the weight of law, stated in bold red letters that my unauthorized barrier was in violation of community aesthetics. As I read through the ridiculous accusations, how my wooden fence was supposedly obstructing the neighborhood's harmonious flow, I almost laughed. They didn't know that the land my fence stood on, along with everything surrounding it, didn't just belong to me. It was my property, all of it. And soon, the HOA would come to regret trying to flex their authority over something they had absolutely no control over. But they weren't ready to hear that yet. No, I would let them dig their own hole first, watch them push their rules and ridiculous fines, all while knowing that I held the real power. This wasn't just a battle over a fence. It was about control, and they were about to learn the hard way that they had picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. The first warning had arrived in the mail a week earlier, a standard form letter with vague language about non-compliance and a demand to restore neighborhood consistency. At first, I ignored it. My fence wasn't new, it had been standing strong for over a year, built with my own hands to give me privacy and security. The HOA had never objected before, but their sudden interest in it told me there was something more going on. When the second letter arrived, this time with an official fine of $1,000 for unapproved construction, I knew they were escalating. And then came the knock on my door, 3 firm, impatient raps that echoed through my hallway. I opened it to find the HOA president herself, arms crossed and a smug expression plastered on her overly confident face. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, launching straight into her prepared speech about community standards and how my fence had become a visual nuisance that needed to be removed immediately. I listened, letting her feel the power she thought she had, nodding occasionally as if I was considering her words. But inside, I was already 10 steps ahead. I knew that the HOA thrived on intimidation, relying on homeowners to back down out of fear of escalating fines and legal threats. But I wasn't just another homeowner. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned more than just my house. Over the years, I had quietly acquired multiple properties in the area, each one carefully registered under different holding companies, making me the majority landowner in the entire community. The very land the HOA claimed to have jurisdiction over? It was mine. Still, I played along, nodding as she rattled off bylaws and procedures, her voice dripping with condescension. When she finally finished, I simply asked for everything in writing, knowing full well they had no legal ground to stand on. She left, confident that she had intimidated me into submission, and within hours, I received a new letter, this time stating that if I didn't remove the fence within 10 days, would face additional fines and possible legal action. That's when I knew it was time to make my move. I spent the next few days gathering paperwork, compiling every deed, every property transfer, and every legal document that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA had no authority over my land. They had been so busy enforcing petty rules that they never even bothered to check who actually controlled the neighborhood. That was their biggest mistake. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, I was ready. I walked into that room with my documents in hand, taking a seat in the back, watching as they smugly discussed the ongoing issue with my fence. They didn't know what was coming. But soon, they would. And when they did, the entire power structure of this community was about to change forever. The HOA meeting was held in the community center, a dull, lifeless room with beige walls and a long wooden table at the front where the board members sat, basking in their self-appointed authority. I had attended before, always sitting quietly in the back, watching them enforce their petty rules, fining families for leaving their trash bins out too long, or demanding that people repaint their front doors for being a shade too dark. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just here to observe. As I took my seat, I could already hear them whispering, casting glances in my direction as if I were some sort of criminal waiting for sentencing. The HOA president, an older woman with perfectly styled hair and an air of entitlement so thick it practically suffocated the room, cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. Her voice was laced with artificial politeness as she announced the main topic of discussion, the so-called unauthorized fence that was disrupting the community's visual harmony. I leaned back, listening to their carefully curated speech, waiting for the right moment to strike. The board members took turns speaking, each one more insufferable than the last. They listed reasons why my fence was a problem, citing rules about community aesthetics and claiming that it clashed with the overall design flow. They brought out printed photographs of my property, placing them in front of the attendees as if they had gathered damning evidence against a dangerous criminal. Their words were confident, their expressions smug, as if they believed this meeting was just a formality before I caved in and agreed to tear down my own fence. But they had no idea that the foundation they were standing on was about to crumble beneath them. As the discussion continued, I could see them riling up the audience, feeding them half-truths and exaggerated claims about how my fence was setting a bad precedent and would lead to chaos if left unchecked. The absurdity of it all almost made me laugh. These people had convinced themselves that they were guardians of order when, in reality, they were nothing more than self-important figureheads desperately clinging to control. And then, the moment arrived. The HOA president straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and formally declared that I had 10 days to comply. Failure to do so, she warned, would result in further fines, potential legal action, and possibly even a lien against my property. She delivered the statement with such confidence, so assured of her authority, that I almost felt bad for what was about to happen next. I pulled out my folder, the thick stack of documents I had spent the last week gathering, and slowly stood up. Every eye in the room turned toward me, the low hum of whispered conversations fading into silence. I could see the brief flicker of uncertainty in the president's eyes as I stepped forward, placing the folder onto the table with a quiet finality that sent a ripple through the room. Without a word, I flipped open the top page, revealing a set of deeds and property records so neatly arranged that even the most clueless board member could understand what they meant. I watched as the president's smug expression faltered, as her fingers tensed against the armrests of her chair. I spoke then, my voice calm, steady, carrying the weight of undeniable truth. I informed them, in clear and precise terms, that their authority ended at the property lines they did not own. I explained, with meticulous detail, how over the years, I had acquired not just my home, but multiple properties within the neighborhood. The land that their so-called regulations claimed to govern? It belonged to me. The very foundation on which they stood, the streets they paraded through, the lots they so confidently dictated rules over, I owned them all. A murmur spread through the room, growing louder with each passing second as people began to realize what this meant. The HOA had no control over my fence, no right to enforce their absurd regulations, because they were standing on land that wasn't even under their jurisdiction. I watched as panic flickered across the president's face, her hands moving to the papers as if she could will them out of existence. But I wasn't done. I turned the page, presenting evidence of mismanaged funds, questionable expenditures, and inconsistencies in their supposed financial reports. Over the years, they had fined countless homeowners, collected thousands in fees, yet their expenses told a different story. I had receipts, records, documented proof that money had gone missing, that resources meant for community improvements had conveniently disappeared under vague and ambiguous classifications. The room erupted then, voices overlapping, neighbors turning to one another, demanding explanations that the board members could no longer provide. I could see the desperation in the president's eyes, the way her grip tightened around the table's edge, her entire carefully constructed world unraveling before her. And then, I delivered the final blow. I pulled out a legal notice, already signed and prepared, officially challenging the HOA's authority over the land they had falsely claimed as their own. With my ownership stake, I had the power to dissolve the current board, to restructure the association, to ensure that no one else in this community would ever be subjected to the same arbitrary rules and power-hungry leadership that had plagued them for years. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, the HOA president had nothing to say. No rehearsed speech, no empty threats, just the realization that she had lost, that her reign over this neighborhood was over. I stepped back, letting the weight of my words settle into the room. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale, their authority crumbling beneath them. The meeting was no longer in their control. The tides had turned, and for the first time in years, the homeowners in this neighborhood saw the truth. This wasn't about a fence. It had never been about a fence. This was about power. And tonight, that power had shifted. The shock in the room was palpable, a silent wave crashing over the board members as they processed the reality of what had just unfolded. The HOA president's face had lost all color, her once confident posture shrinking under the weight of undeniable evidence. The audience was no longer on her side, the murmurs turning into full-fledged conversations as neighbors flipped through the documents I had placed before them, pointing to figures that didn't add up, transactions that had no explanation, fines that had been collected without a legitimate paper trail. For years, they had assumed these fees were necessary evils, believing that their money was going toward the upkeep of the community, but now, faced with undeniable proof of financial mismanagement, their faith in the HOA crumbled. The president, still desperate to salvage her authority, attempted to regain control, calling for order, her voice trembling beneath the surface. But it was too late. The power she had wielded so effortlessly over the years had been stripped away in mere minutes, leaving behind nothing but the uncomfortable reality of her own downfall. I remained standing as the room erupted, listening as neighbors shared their own grievances, their own encounters with the HOA's unjust rule. An elderly woman near the back raised a trembling hand, her voice filled with quiet frustration as she recalled the time she had been fined for having a flower pot that didn't meet HOA color standards, despite half the board members having equally non-compliant decorations in their own yards. A young couple stepped forward, recounting how they had been threatened with legal action over the placement of their children's bicycles, while the president's friends had parked their oversized vehicles on the street for years without consequence. It became clear, in that moment, that this wasn't just about me. This was about all of us. The HOA had ruled with hypocrisy, enforcing their own version of justice selectively, punishing those they deemed beneath them while allowing their inner circle to do as they pleased. The board members, visibly shaken, clung to the last remnants of their control, attempting to redirect the conversation, insisting that these issues could be resolved internally, that there was no need for drastic measures. But their voices lacked conviction. Their carefully crafted illusion of power had been shattered, and now, with the truth laid bare, the people they had ruled over for so long were no longer willing to accept their governance. The president turned to me then, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line, her eyes filled with something between hatred and desperation. She was searching for a way out, an escape route that would allow her to walk away unscathed, but there wasn't one. Not anymore. I reached into my folder one final time, producing a document that sent another ripple through the already tense atmosphere. It was an official motion to dissolve the current HOA board, a legal challenge backed by the majority property owner, me. The weight of my ownership meant that I had the authority to restructure the leadership, to call for an emergency vote, to ensure that the very people who had abused their positions for years were stripped of their titles and left with nothing. The room fell into a hush once more, the implications settling in as the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the realization dawning on them that their reign was truly over. The president tried one final, feeble attempt at resistance, insisting that this was illegal, that there were processes to follow, that I couldn't simply walk in and dismantle the system they had built. But her words carried no weight. I had already done my research, already prepared for every possible counterargument. My lawyers had spent weeks ensuring that every action I took was airtight, that every document I presented was backed by legal precedent. She had no ground to stand on, no loophole to escape through. The HOA's house of cards had collapsed, and there was nothing left to do but watch it fall. As the reality of the situation became undeniable, the shift in power solidified. Homeowners who had once feared retaliation now spoke freely, their voices carrying the frustration of years spent under the HOA's oppressive rule. Demands for transparency filled the air, questions about missing funds, about unapproved expenditures, about why the neighborhood had suffered while board members had thrived. The president looked around wildly, her carefully controlled empire slipping from her grasp, but no one was looking to her for answers anymore. They were looking to me. And so, with the weight of the community behind me, I made my final statement clear. Effective immediately, the HOA as it stood would be dismantled, its leadership disbanded, its corrupt practices purged from the neighborhood. There would be new leadership, a fair system, one where homeowners had a voice, where rules were enforced equally, where power belonged to the people rather than a select few who sought to exploit it. The board members, realizing their fight was over, had no choice but to accept their fate. One by one, they resigned, their departures met with quiet satisfaction rather than the reverence they had once expected. The president was the last to go, her hands clenched into fists, her lips tight with barely contained fury. She muttered something about seeking legal action, about not going down without a fight, but even she knew it was nothing more than empty bluster. She had lost. As I left the meeting that night, the air felt different, lighter somehow. The weight of an unjust system had been lifted, and in its place, something new was beginning to take shape. Change was coming, real change, and for the first time in years, this neighborhood would be governed not by fear, but by fairness. I walked past the board members as they quietly gathered their belongings, past the president as she stood frozen in place, staring at the documents that had sealed her fate. My fence, the supposed catalyst for this entire ordeal, still stood tall and unwavering, a symbol of everything that had transpired. And just like that, the HOA that had once ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist was no more. The battle was won, and the community, at long last, was free. The days following the HOA's collapse were filled with a strange, almost surreal silence. The usual fear that once hung over the neighborhood like an unshakable fog had dissipated, leaving behind something unfamiliar: relief. Homeowners who had spent years walking on eggshells, carefully measuring every decision to avoid the wrath of the HOA, now moved with a newfound ease. Driveways that had once been meticulously monitored were filled with cars that no longer needed to be hidden away. Gardens flourished with colors that had once been deemed too vibrant for the community's uniformity. Children played freely in yards that had previously been subject to warnings for unsightly clutter. It was as if the neighborhood had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. Yet, amidst the quiet victory, there were still remnants of the past that needed to be addressed. The HOA president had not gone down gracefully. Despite her resignation, she had attempted to rally her former supporters, whispering tales of legal battles and financial ruin. She tried to incite panic, claiming that without the HOA's oversight, property values would plummet, the streets would fall into chaos, and the neighborhood would descend into disrepair. But her fearmongering had lost its grip. The people who had once followed her blindly now saw the truth. They remembered the arbitrary fines, the selective punishments, the money that had vanished without explanation. No one wanted to return to that system, no matter how many times she insisted that it had been for their own good. Still, I wasn't naive. Power-hungry individuals never surrendered easily. I knew she wasn't finished, that she would find a way to make one last desperate attempt to reclaim her influence. And sure enough, it came in the form of a lawsuit. Just weeks after the dissolution of the HOA, she filed an official complaint, claiming that my acquisition of multiple properties had been a calculated effort to undermine community governance. She alleged that I had manipulated homeowners, used deceptive tactics to gain control, and had single-handedly caused the downfall of an institution that had kept the neighborhood safe and structured for decades. Her argument was weak, built on desperation rather than legal merit, but I had prepared for this. I had expected it. By the time the case reached the courtroom, I had everything I needed to dismantle her claims piece by piece. My lawyers presented clear, indisputable evidence, documents proving that every property acquisition had been legal, every transaction transparent, every action within my rights as a landowner. More importantly, we presented financial audits that exposed the full extent of the HOA's mismanagement. Funds that had been collected under the guise of community improvements had never been spent on repairs. Fees that had been issued for supposed violations had mysteriously disappeared from the official records. The final blow came when former board members stepped forward, admitting under oath that they had been coerced into approving unjust policies, that they had witnessed the president redirecting funds for personal use, that they had remained silent out of fear of retaliation. When the judge ruled in my favor, dismissing her case entirely and ordering a full investigation into the HOA's past financial practices, the last remnants of her power crumbled. The former president, once so confident in her ability to manipulate and control, had been reduced to nothing more than a disgraced figure, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. She left the courtroom in silence, her threats exhausted, her influence shattered. The neighborhood had moved on, and there was no place left for her in it. With the legal battle behind us, it was time to rebuild, not just the policies that governed the community, but the trust that had been broken over the years. A new system was put in place, one that prioritized fairness over control, one that valued the voices of homeowners rather than silencing them. Decisions were now made collectively, with open discussions and transparent voting. Fees were only imposed for necessary maintenance, every dollar accounted for, every expenditure justified. The oppressive grip of the old regime had been replaced with something better, something built on trust rather than fear. And as for my fence, the very thing that had sparked this entire battle, it remained exactly where it had always been, standing firm, untouched, a silent testament to everything that had transpired. What had once been deemed an unauthorized barrier had become a symbol of defiance, a reminder that power belonged not to those who sought to control, but to those who refused to be controlled. Months later, as I stood at the edge of my property, looking out over the land that had once been governed by greed and hypocrisy, I felt something rare: peace. The neighborhood had changed, not just in rules, but in spirit. There was laughter where there had once been whispers, unity where there had once been division. And in that moment, I knew that the fight had been worth it. Because in the end, it had never been about the fence. It had been about something far greater, taking back what rightfully belonged to the people. And this time, no one would ever take it away again.